Welcome to the Experience Darden podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share my recent conversation with Lucy Alexander. Lucy is a Darden alum. She is a graduate from the full-time MBA class of 2001, and she and I recently connected to talk more about her background, her decision to pursue an MBA, what led her to Darden, the impact of her Darden experience, what she's been up to since graduation, and so much more. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. And as always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to Experience Darden so you never miss an update. And remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. Now, without further ado, here is my conversation with Lucy Alexander. Lucy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. How is everything going? How were your holidays?
Nice, actually. I live outside of Washington, D.C., and so holidays were quickly superseded with 8 inches of snow, which for anyone from the region knows doesn't happen that often. I've spent more time shoveling in the past 48 hours than I have in a few years. But no, the holidays were great. I'm just looking forward to warmer weather. It's very cold here right now, and I'm not a cold weather person. Staying very bundled up.
I'm right there with you. I'm based in the DC area. I work out of our space in Roslyn, and high today is like 30 degrees, 31 degrees. I'm not into this at all. No way. Well, thanks for your time. It's so exciting to have you here on the podcast. And we oftentimes will feature, current student perspectives. We'll have faculty and staff on the podcast, and excited to have an alum here today. Talk a little bit more about your MBA journey and what you've been up to since graduation, how your time at Darden has continued to be helpful to you as you move forward in your career. Before we get to all of that, tell us a little bit more about your story and what you did before coming to Darden.
Yeah. So I grew up in the DC area, and back in the day, I'm gonna really date myself here. Really, there wasn't a lot of industry, I guess I'd call it, in the DC area. You would typically work for the government, or you were a lawyer, or you were a lobbyist. And I didn't really want to do any of those things. I actually did end up in consulting. And it was actually turned out I was in international consulting, and that took me to Europe. And while I was there, it was also when the pharma business was starting to really take off. So that was actually my first foray introduction into healthcare. Was I moved into a healthcare vertical when I was in consulting. And I did consulting for about 9 years. It was all very exciting. But what I realized after 9 years was that, a lot of consulting is actually kind of the same thing over and over again, just for different clients, particularly once you develop a sort of a specialty area. And so I wanted to do something else. And it was very funny, actually. I went to a career consultant because I didn't really know what I wanted to be when I grew up at that point. And the career consultant did the usual interviews and sort of battery of tests. And she said, you should be in operations. And I literally laughed because I said, oh, I'm in consulting. No one's going to hire me in operations. And she started pointing out a lot of things that I did, a lot of project management and consulting as an example. I did a lot of data analysis. And she said, these are all things that are very relevant for operations. And so I was like, well, that's an interesting perspective. And I sort of mulled on it for a while. And I thought, maybe what I should do is go to business school and figure out what I want to do, but also sort of pursue this operations thing a little bit more. So that's actually what led me to Darden. I looked at a number of different business school programs, and I had some quite specific criteria. One of which was I had been working for 9 years, which in those days anyway was kind of a long time for people who then decided to go back to business school. But I'm like, I'm not going to be doing textbooks and lectures and all that stuff. I'm beyond that. So I really wanted case study method. I wanted hands-on practical. I'm like, that's the way my brain works. So, that narrowed the list down pretty quickly. And Darden was just the right choice for many reasons.
Had you spent, obviously growing up in the DC area, had you spent much time in Charlottesville? Had you been to UVA before?
Yeah, I had. I went to high school, and I went to a public high school in Alexandria, Virginia. So knew lots of people who had gone to UVA, knew UVA. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, right? Charlottesville. If you grow up in Virginia, you have that experience. So yeah, I'd spent a fair amount of time in Charlottesville, as a visitor. But it's definitely one of the places, it's certainly my experience growing up in Virginia, one of those places that you frequent in your youth. So yeah, and my sister actually went to UVA Law. We both applied to UVA undergrad. So definitely, yeah, very familiar, felt very familiar anyway with UVA in Charlottesville.
You come to business school, and you mentioned that you've been working for 9 years. What was the adjustment to being back in school like? I can sometimes, I mean, I work a lot with our executive MBA students and part-time MBA students, and sometimes when people haven't been in school for a while, there's a little bit of rust, some startup friction, being back in a school environment, having homework, not owning your schedule in the same kind of way that you do when you work. What was the adjustment like for you?
Well, maybe because I'd been in consulting, I never felt I owned my own schedule. So that wasn't a change. As everybody knows, it's very rigorous and intense at Darden. And quite regimented, right? So classes started at whatever ungodly hour of the morning they started, which probably actually wasn't that early. But so then we were in classes, obviously. I think classes stopped at about 1 p.m. in those days. And then, you had, activities, right? Whether it was clubs, recruiting type activities, right? Whatever that happened. Plus you had to, of course, prepare for your learning team. And then my learning team met at 8 o'clock in the evening, and we finished up around 10:30. So I would say the days were longer. The fact that I couldn't just shut off at 5, 6 o'clock, right? There was still another 4+ hours to go. I think that was one of the biggest changes for me. I really did not feel I was in control of my own schedule because there was so much happening all the time. I was a member of the operations club, right, and a number of different activities. And so you just felt like it was go, go, go all the time. So honestly, I felt like there was less downtime when I was at Darden than I was used to from a working life. But beyond that, no, not really a huge change. I remember I had a friend in graduate school, and he was doing humanities PhD. And, he would say to me things like, oh, I have to get ready for a test, or I have to exam, or I have to write a paper. And I remember saying to him when I was working, I'm like, every day is a test for me. And honestly, it felt that way at Darden, right? Every day you're in class, you're doing case studies, you get cold called, right? So I did actually feel that way every day at Darden. Every day was a test. But in a good way, right? That's how you learn. That's how you get stretched. And I think that's part of, it's the only business school I've ever been to, but I think that's part of the value of the case study method and the way Darden teaches.
You mentioned being interested in Darden expressly because of the case method and the learning experience. What was it like to be in those classes? You mentioned the accountability that comes with it, right? Having to be prepared for class. But what was the case method like? What did you enjoy about it?
Oh my gosh, so many things. Well, as I said before, because I've been working, I was very hands-on practical. And I think that is really the essence of the case study method. I mean, you are immersed, right? You're presented with a business situation, and you're expected to come up with an answer. I remember after one case, we pressed the professor, who I think was actually Bruner, and somebody said, "Well, what's the right answer?" And I'll never forget. He said, "There is no right answer, just many wrong ones." And I use that all the time, actually coaching people in the workplace. And I think they're very wise words, as you would expect from him. But so I think, as I say, they're real life business situations, and you are expected to make a decision and have an action plan, and you're expected to be able to justify it, right? So that for me is very much like doing business every day. Every meeting I go to, every responsibility I have, right? I'm expected to have an opinion. It's expected to be a well-formulated opinion that I can defend. Other people may have other opinions, right? Which is exactly what happens in class discussions, right? Of case studies. So it means say, well, I looked at the same information, or I and my team looked at the same information, and we actually came to a different conclusion, or a slightly different conclusion anyway. So I think for me, it really felt like what I was used to from a business environment and what I was expecting from a business environment. And certainly when I left Darden, I went to J&J, and I was there as an intern, and then went back full time after my internship. I felt very much at home in that environment because I just felt the training was exactly like what I was faced with. I will say the one difference I found was that in cases, it may not be complete information, but it's a lot more information than you frequently have in the real world when you have to make a decision. Now, part of that's because, if you're in a certain role, operations for a life sciences company, as an example, right? You have some context to start with in when you're actually in a job. Whereas, of course, in business school, you're presented with different cases from different industries all the time, right? So you don't necessarily walk into it with an understanding of, retail, as an example, insurance, right? So certain cases have to provide you with a bit of that anyway that you would expect to have normally. But yeah, I think that the discussion aspect of it, again, people asking questions, challenging you, presenting different points of view. And sometimes, you formulate your thinking through that process too. That's also part of the advantage of the learning team, which again, for me is very similar to how I operate and in a management position. Is, it's not like I just sit here and make all the decisions and go out and tell people, right? It's a lot of sort of crowdsourcing, honestly, right? Talking to colleagues, talking to people on my team, consulting different people, getting different pieces of information, and then piecing it all together. My general approach is I tend to be more consensus based whenever I can be, because I think that's the power of the team. And again, I think that's something that really, again, you see in the learning team environment, you see in the case study, going through case studies as well.
So you mentioned discovering this interest in operations through your conversation with a career counselor. You come to Darden. Obviously, it sounds like you stuck with this interest in operations through your time in the MBA program. Tell us a little bit more about how your career interests evolved, stayed the same, how you explored this career interest during your time at Darden.
Yeah, that was really funny, actually, because I say the career counselor told me that, and I literally laughed, as I said before. And so when I went to Darden, actually, I had been in marketing consulting. And so I actually thought, well, I'll learn more about marketing. I'll get the full management, education, finance, all that great stuff. And, and then I'll probably go in-house to a company and do marketing. And all my learning team members are laughing if they're listening to this. So of course, when you start at Darden, you take the full curriculum, right? At that time, it was 10 different subject areas, and everybody takes everything, right? We always say, even if you've been an accountant for 10 years, you're still going to take the accounting class. And so about 6 weeks in, we started operations. And it was the proverbial light bulb went off. All of a sudden, I was like, oh, now I understand what she was talking about. Now I understand why this made sense to her, because all of a sudden it made sense to me. And so, and again, hopefully some of the operations professors are still around, but, everything sort of clicked at that point. And so I'm like, operations, I want to do operations. So, again, I joined the operations club, right? I started really fixing on operations, taking a lot of the operations classes, particularly my second year. Went to J&J, did my internship in operations. In fact, it was really funny when I was going through recruiting. And again, I had a fantastic support from the career services office. And I remember someone named Brian. And I was interested in consumer products in those days. And so I kept going to these interviews with consumer product companies, and they would look at my resume and say, well, you'd be really good in marketing. I'm like, no, I want to be in operations. So anyway, it all worked out. I ended up in an operations internship with J&J, and it clearly went well. And then they hired me back into their planning organization in the J&J consumer companies. So that's the story of how I got into operations. And actually, one of the things that I say is I think I really bring to operations, and I'm in supply chain management specifically, but is that I understand the marketing perspective. So I used to say that when I was in consulting, I would go with my clients to a meeting with their operations team, and literally the marketing people would sit on one side of the table and the operations people would sit on the other side of the table. And my clients would say, oh, we've got this great idea, and we want to do this, and this is exciting, and it's going to increase sales, and the operations people would sit across the table and they would say, yeah, we can't do that. And that would be the end of the conversation. And so even in consulting, before I went to business school, I was always like, I wonder why. There's got to be more to that conversation. And so one of the things I've always really enjoyed in my career now is I understand both perspectives, right? I also understand the financial perspectives, and right, everybody's sort of points of view. And so I'm able to come up with creative solutions, because I understand what the marketing people are trying to achieve, and I understand what the operations people need to achieve. So yeah, it's worked out really well for me, although, as I say, honestly, unexpected until I came to Darden and I took an operations class.
I'm curious, what is about operations that really clicked with you? What is it that appealed?
I think it's a few things. One is this sounds a bit silly. It's very concrete, right? In operations, you're dealing with real things. You're dealing with units of product. You're dealing with cartons, with shippers, with pallets, with trucks, with manufacturing, with equipment. So it sounds a bit odd, but I'm much more comfortable in an environment where I'm dealing with real things. My finance professors would tell you this is something I struggled with in finance, where I found finance full of a lot of abstract concepts, right? I understand them, but dollars to me aren't really sort of concrete things, right? And finance people would probably say they aren't anyway, right? Certainly in banking, right? There aren't concrete things. So that's when I realized that I really prefer dealing with real things that you can touch and see. I don't know why, it's just the way I am. Anyway, so I'm very intuitive in that space. People would argue, well, the quantitative skills are the same in finance, but the concepts are different. And so, I'm definitely much more of an operations person than I am a finance person. I also just really like seeing things literally materialize, right? So you plan out, okay, it's going to take these ingredients, it's going to take these materials, whatever it is to make a product. And then you put it through all the manufacturing processes and you get this beautiful thing at the end, right? It could be a tube of toothpaste. It could be, in my business, a bottle of pills that's going to help somebody get over whatever their condition is. So I really like that aspect too. It almost feels like sort of alchemy or magic, right? You take these disparate things, but you get this thing at the end of it that's different. It's transformed, and it does something that's really valuable to the person who then receives it.
Love both of those points. It makes a lot of sense when you explain it that way. So you mentioned starting at Johnson and Johnson in supply chain management. How did you have any choice? Did you pick supply chain management? Supply chain management, was that picked for you? I'm curious.
Yeah, so the story of how I went to J&J. So a few things. One was I was very particular, I guess is the word, about the kind of company that I went to work for. And honestly, one of my biggest things was about the values of the company. I wasn't particularly tied to an industry, although clearly I had healthcare experience and I continue to be a big fan of healthcare. I marvel all the time at literally what science can do to help improve people's lives. And just some really cool stuff. I mean, all the way from, just simple things like you have a headache, you take a painkiller and your headache goes away. I every time I do that, I think, okay, 300 years ago, people didn't have this option. If you had a headache, you just had a headache. And then you take that all the way, you scale that up through thinking about things like curing people's cancer, which we can do today. Jimmy Carter just died, and people talk about how he had cancer that had metastasized to his brain, and through one of the more recent oncology medications, they were able to make that go away. Right, that didn't happen 50 years ago. So I was very interested in the values and the mission and purpose of the company that I went to. And interesting enough, so the way I got into operations or supply chain management at J&J was actually through marketing. So there was a second year who had done her internship at J&J. And so I reached out to her and I said, I'm interested in J&J, but I'm interested in operations. Do you know anybody that you could connect me with? And she was like, absolutely. When I did my internship, I worked with lots of people in planning and supply chain management. So she connected me with a couple of people there she had worked with. And so they were like, yeah, we take interns. And so I went up there, I interviewed. It was a little bit unusual because J&J did not, at that time anyway, come on grounds at Darden to recruit. They came on grounds to recruit for marketing, but not for operations. And again, I was a little bit weird, right? Because I looked like a marketing person, but I really was an operations person, at least in my opinion. And so it was very funny. It was back in the days of voice messages. And so I got home from class one day, having been up there for interviews, and I had a voice message, and it was somebody I'd interviewed with, one of these contacts, and he said, thank you so much for coming up to interview. We really appreciate it. It was great to meet you. And I'm thinking, this is all the sugarcoating for telling me, that they're not going to offer me an internship. And then he said, and so we'd really like to offer you an internship, and here are the details. And I was like, what? So yeah, so I don't know that I exactly had a choice. I think it was just a really good fit. I think, marketing works a lot with supply chain. And so I think, that connection probably is what happened, but then it was just a really good fit for me. And so yeah, so I went to J&J in supply chain as an intern, and then, as I say, went back full time. And then J&J's approach, certainly in those days, was they brought you in at more or less an entry-level position, so you literally learn the business from the bottom up, which was great experience to have. I refer back to that experience all the time today. And then also to move you around into different parts of operations. So while I was at J&J, I had the opportunity to work in supply chain planning. I worked in procurement. I worked in business operations. I worked in external manufacturing. It was a great experience. It really made me very well-rounded.
That's excellent to hear about all the different experiences that you had. Obviously, you're at J&J for a while, you're AstraZeneca after that. So tell us a little bit more about how your career has evolved since your time at Darden. I'm just curious about the twists and turns.
Yeah. Well, and there are many. You think, oh, I'm going to map all this out, and then life will just happen the way I think it's going to, and then of course it doesn't. So, so I was at J&J for 10 years. It was a great 10 years. I said I got lots of different experience. One of the parts of experience I wanted to get to make me, what I felt was really well-rounded from an operations perspective, and honestly, the career guidance I'd been getting at J&J, and again, they were very focused on helping manage people's careers and their development, was that I needed manufacturing experience. So I won't get into the details, but there weren't a lot of manufacturing opportunities in J&J at the time in the U.S., certainly in the consumer. Well, I guess I was in the OTC business at that point. Over the counter. So I was contacted by a recruiter, a headhunter, from a smaller company, pharma company, who were looking for someone to head up planning, external manufacturing, and procurement for them. And I had all that experience thanks to J&J. And so I went out, and it was also it was actually a dermatology company. And so I went out and interviewed with them, and it was a great opportunity. I'd have a bigger role, but they also did manufacturing, so I was going to be based at a manufacturing site. So it was just a really good opportunity for where I was in my career. I was very sad to leave J&J, but it was the right thing for me in my career, and it all worked out really well. That's actually another interesting story, because I moved to that company. And at the time I joined them, they were it was part of a larger, medium-sized, but firm in Europe. And 2 weeks after I joined, they announced that the European company was being acquired by a large pharma company, Takeda, if anybody knows Takeda. But Takeda didn't want the U.S. operations; they only wanted the European operations. So they were spinning out the U.S. operations. So within literally the space of about 4 weeks, I went from very large pharma J&J, which at the time was probably 50,000 employees, to being spun out into a company of 700 employees, most of which was field sales force. So I was kind of like, whoa, what just happened? And I thought for a minute, well, I could call, it's not too late. I can call J&J, get my job back. And I thought, well, I had very specific reasons for why I took this opportunity. And nothing that's changed has necessarily changed anything that affects what that company was actually owned by private equity. And it turned out to be a really great experience. I got to be on the leadership team of the company, which would not have happened for years, if ever, at a large company. We had a management team come in, put together by the private equity. It turned out that the program officer had also been at J&J. So we had that in common, and it turned out to just be a really good experience. I got all sorts of opportunities that I would not have gotten otherwise through that. So yeah, you never know, twists and turns, right? You never know what's going to happen, and I think it's about really kind of thinking about what is it that I want? What am I focused on? And then pursuing that kind of come hell or high water, if you will.
So how do you get from that role to your current role at AstraZeneca?
So yeah, so another one could say happenstance, right? But also I think about kind of knowing what I wanted for my career. So I was with that company, and the intention of the private equity owners was always to sell that company once it was spun out. It was too small for their portfolio. So, and we knew that, right? That was part of why they brought in the management team, and they were actively looking for another company to acquire that business. And actually, they ended up selling that company to Novartis, another large pharma. So I was back in large pharma. I have to say I had a very good experience through that as well. And that opened up a whole other set of opportunities. But I was from the Washington area originally, and I was at the point in my life when, honestly, my parents were getting older, and I really wanted to be closer to family. I was really tired of driving up and down 95 every holiday from New Jersey back down to Virginia. And as it happened, I saw a position that I thought would be a really good fit for me at a local company here at the time called MedImmune. It had been a biotech startup about 15 years, I guess, before. And I had two former colleagues from J&J, back to J&J Connection, who were at this company. So I called them and I said, "Seeing this role, I think it would be good for me. What do you think?" And they were like, "Absolutely. I think you'd be a great fit. It's a good company." I ended up as an employee referral. So they helped me kind of through the recruiting process. So I came to what at the time, as I say, was actually an operating unit called MedImmune. It was owned by AZ. AZ had acquired MedImmune, I want to say in roughly 2005, and this was 2013, so a few years before. So that was how I ended up at AZ. As I say, I started out in this operating unit, and then over time, they integrated that operating unit into the rest of sort of bigger AZ AstraZeneca. And so then I had multiple opportunities for different roles within bigger AstraZeneca.
So obviously, you have a deep experience in operations, lots of different roles on different scales, companies, all these kinds of things. What do you feel like is your real strength in this area? Like where do you feel like you add value? What are you particularly good at?
I think, I mentioned before my sort of general approach is sort of a consensus one. And I think that I think that's valuable. I spend a lot of time seeking other people's input for a few reasons. One is I don't know everything. In fact, I would say I know very little in many cases. Sometimes we're dealing with highly technical issues, and I want the advice of my technical colleagues, whom I love. They're all amazing, fascinating, really smart people who know way more than I do. Or whether it's the marketing team and really understanding what the marketing team is trying to achieve. And then trying to find that kind of middle ground in the middle, right? Sort of Venn diagram, if you will, about, so what is it we're all trying to achieve, which at the end of the day should all be the same thing, right? We all work for the same company, but as we all know, different functions, right, are tasked with different accountabilities. And sometimes there's healthy tension there, right? So I think kind of understanding all that, being able to collect and amass all that, and then to manage the discussions and the dynamics to to get everybody on board. So, and again, I know I keep harping on about Darden. I think, again, a lot of this is case study method, learning team, right? I think that is very much the way that the Darden education works. And I think it's really, I mean, you think about just, the sense of the academic village and the community. I think it's the same thing. So yeah, I think it's funny. I've had marketing people comment on that. I've had technical people comment on that. They all really feel that, I'm involving them. I'm seeking their input, and it's very collaborative is the word that people use a lot. So yeah, I think if you were to ask people I work with, I think that's probably one of the common themes that they would all call out. And I honestly think it leads to the best solution. I don't think one person ever has all the answers or even, frankly, the right answer. So I think going through that process is really valuable.
It also feels like operations, supply chain, these kinds of things have been in the news more over the past 3, 4 years than certainly at any point in my life. I don't remember talking about, supply chain disruptions or how things get to the United States, how they get distributed in the United States, quite at the same clip as we have over these past few years.
Yeah, it's funny. Years ago, when I used to tell people I was in supply chain, their eyes would glaze over, and I could see them thinking, "I have no idea what you're talking about, and I'm not really interested." So frequently, I would just tell them I was in manufacturing or something like that because it was just easier. But you're right, right? Through the pandemic, we've all learned a lot more about what a supply chain is and why it's so important. Which I'm actually very grateful for. I'm sorry that's the way the world had to be educated. But as we all know, I mean, the pandemic was actually a fascinating phenomenon from a supply chain perspective, because I'm not sure if people remember going back a few years, but one of the things that happened very early on was it was very hard to find frozen vegetables. I don't know if people remember that. I happen to eat a lot of frozen vegetables, so I was particularly aware of this. So you would go to the grocery store, and there was no fresh produce and very few frozen vegetables. And people would comment that part of that was because pre-pandemic, pre-quarantine and everything being shut down, right? A lot of vegetables were consumed through restaurants, catering services, right? All that was shut down. So you had supply chains funneling vegetables right into that, to your point, distribution, into that distribution channel, but there wasn't a distribution happening to consumers through that channel. Right. And it actually takes a lot to then redirect all that right into a different distribution channel, which actually goes into grocery stores. Right. So those are two quite different supply chains, same commodity, same product, but in very different supply chains. And then you start to think about it and you think about volumes and how people then use it. And right, the fact that, industrial production versus, people cooking it for their kids for dinner at home, right? Quite different. So I think people then started to understand that a little bit more. And so, it took time for the supply chains to adjust. And then we had the flip side, right, where everybody started ordering Pelotons apparently, because they were all at home and nobody was able to go to the gym. And so, so then Peloton was like, oh my God, we didn't anticipate, we were going to have 10 times the number of orders for stationary bikes. And so, right, so then there was a big backlog of that, right? So what happens is, of course, then the supply chains ramp up. They're like, oh, okay, we're seeing this tenfold increase in demand. We need to be able to manufacture 10 times more stationary bikes or whatever it is, right? Well, then all of a sudden, right, we shifted back. And now all of a sudden people again, it takes a long time to source raw materials, get them where they need to be for manufacture whatever it is, right? Then put it on a boat typically, right? To ship it then to someplace else where it then goes into a distribution center or warehouse and it sits there. And then sometimes it goes to different distribution centers in the same region and then people place orders, right? And then it gets shipped to you. It takes a long time to set all that up and then to actually go through that process. So, right. So then we had this problem where now people didn't want Pelotons. People were going back to the gym or had realized that, oh, I have this Peloton that I've been hanging my clothes on for the past 18 months. I guess I don't really need that. Right. So then all those supply chains had to shift back. And then an additional complication, which I found fascinating, because even though I've been in the industry for a while, I kind of hadn't made this connection, was shipping containers. Right. So these are the enormous metal boxes, in essence, right, that go onto ships. And you see them, they're on flatbed trucks. You see them 18-wheelers going up and down the highway. And that's when they're being moved on land. And then they literally, those metal boxes on the flatbed trucks literally get lifted off by a crane and put on a ship, a cargo vessel, right? And they ship off and they go someplace. Right? That's how we move goods around. That process just sort of happens naturally in and of itself. That shipping container goes to Singapore, it gets unloaded, it gets refilled with stuff, it then goes to Germany, it gets unloaded, it gets refilled with stuff. Well, because of all the disruptions in this sort of natural rhythm, we ended up with shipping containers all like stuck in China, as an example, right? And they didn't have enough in Germany, right? Pick your other location to be able to fill them with goods and ship them out, right? So things like that people don't think about when it comes to managing a supply chain. And we'd never, certainly not in my lifetime, seen that level of disruption all at once. So yes, people understand that a lot more, right? We're all familiar with seeing all the ships backed up, waiting outside ports, anchored, hundreds of ships for days, right? Because they couldn't get into the port because there weren't enough trucks to unload, right? So you start to understand how a supply chain is kind of like a big machine with lots of little cogs, and you have to manage all the cogs to turn at roughly the same speed for things to flow through. And if any part of that gets disrupted, you're not going to get what you're looking for.
Yeah, there's so many interesting conversations that happened around that time, particularly related to supply chain, whether it's consolidation in particular industries. Yeah, people learned a lot more about how the ports of entry worked in the United States, for example. There's all kinds of things that, to your point, that I don't think people thought about too deeply until all of a sudden there was this significant disruption. Lucy, I want to ask you just a couple more questions, largely about your time at Darden and what that's meant to you. Over the course of your life and career. So, first, do you have a favorite memory from your time at Darden? Something that comes to mind when you think about the couple of years that you spent in Charlottesville?
Oh, wow. That's a really tough one. There's lots of those. I remember, dinners at professors' houses, back to the whole academic village. That was, an amazing experience. One of the things that I know we continue to sort of joke about was we did this simulation one day in class. It was the whole day, right? So all the sections were all working together in the simulation. I don't know if they still do it or not, but basically we were designated into different companies, manufacturing companies. The first thing we had to do was choose what we were going to manufacture. And I can't remember what all the choices were. There were like three choices. One of them was you're going to manufacture haiku, right? So the Japanese poems, and I don't know if Darden still does this or not. But anyway, so we, to this day, classmates and I will send haikus around to each other in waxing nostalgic about that simulation, which was a really funny experience. I remember when the workers went on strike. I knew the person who was head of HR for that company, simulated company, right? And I was like, oh, that was a bad day. So that was a really fun, cool experience that we still laugh about today.
And what has the Darden network, Darden community meant to you over the course of your career?
Yeah, as I said at the start, the Darden network is how I got my first job, which is what then led to everything else. I remember when, again, I was a bit of an anomaly or something because I had this marketing background, but I wanted to be in operations. And again, back in those days, there wasn't a lot of operations recruiting, certainly not in consumer goods, which is what I was interested in, on grounds at Darden. There was a lot of marketing recruiting from those companies. And so I use the Darden network heavily, and I'm not really a natural networker. So, I would go through the alumni directory and find people at the companies I was interested in, and, they might be in a finance role or whatever role they were in, and I would just cold call them, right? And say, here's who I am. I'm interested in doing an internship, with your company. Here's why. And, everybody took my calls. Everybody was excited to talk to me. I remember one of them, in fact, was at Hershey, and this was in the early days of e-commerce. And he called me back and he said, we need somebody to figure out an e-commerce strategy for us. Is that something you would be interested in? And I mean, I almost literally fell off my chair. I'm like, oh my God, that's huge. So, I ended up going to J&J. So yeah, just the network is just phenomenal. As I say, every time I've reached out to anyone from Darden, just embraced with open arms. So I think that the network is incredibly valuable, incredibly important. I think the close-knit community really lends itself to that. I think being a slightly smaller business school, at least it was in the days when I was there. And again, it's really focused on community and developing those close relationships. It's a very intense experience, right? So I think you really get very strongly bonded. Even with people you might not know that well, you have that common experience that you all went through. In the trenches almost, that I think creates that really tight bond sort of forever, honestly. I have a group of friends that, we still get together for a weekend away together every year. It's phenomenal. Somebody started that as a personal leadership project. And here we are 20 plus years later. and we're all still doing it. So yeah, I think that I talked to people who went to other business schools. At the time I was considering Darden, there was somebody that came down for some sort of recruiting weekend kind of thing. And I spent a lot of time with another woman who actually ended up going to Wharton at Penn, and we stayed in touch and sort of compared notes. And I remember the stories she would tell me about Wharton. I was like, I'm glad I didn't go there. It was very competitive, right? It was one of the things I always remark about Darden is it's not about who gets across the line first. It's about getting everybody across the line. And if you think about that, that's actually a much harder task. And if I look at other business schools, they seem much more focused on I need to be the person who crosses the line first. And I'm like, that's just not, I don't know, just doesn't feel very productive to me in the long run. Yeah, so I think those are some of my, I guess, reflections on the value of the Darden experience and how it's played out for me, why it remains so important to me today.
How have you stayed engaged with the school as an alum? Obviously, Darden has many reunions, lots of ways to come back to Charlottesville, lots of networking events out in cities all around the country and the world. Any ways that you stayed engaged that have been particularly meaningful to you beyond the things that you've mentioned already?
Well, I think I'm fortunate that I'm in the DC area, right? So there are a number of events here. One of the things I really enjoy doing is going to recruiting events. So talking to prospective students to share with them what the Darden experience is like, because I do think it's different from many other schools, and I think it was definitely the right place for me, and I want to make sure that if it's the right place for other people that they understand that, because it is quite different. And it's not the right place for you, then absolutely, right? You need to look someplace else. So recruiting events. To your point, we have someone here in the DC area who hosts an alumni Christmas party every year, which is phenomenal. Actually, just recently, one of my classmates who's actually at Loyola University in Baltimore. She runs their entrepreneurship program. So she reached out to me because they have some entrepreneurs who are in the biomedical space. I'm delighted again, the closest of the network. I was delighted to hear from her, and I'm now involved with that program. As I say, I have connections with classmates that continue to this day. And again, we had the webcast recently on diversity at Darden, and something else I'm very passionate about. Particularly in operations, right? You tend to see fewer numbers of women. When I was at Darden, we actually had one of the classes, the class of 2001, had a particularly low number of women in it. I don't know why. You could probably educate me on that. But so I'm very passionate about supporting women through education and business school programs, Darden specifically, but also in their careers. So so I'm delighted to be part of that as well.
Last question for you here. What's a piece of advice you would share with our listeners as they think about their own MBA journeys?
I think it's really think about what's right for you. So when I applied to several different programs, and I was quite clear with myself on what my criteria were and what I thought would be the best environment for me. So I was very particular, specific about the what I was looking for in business school education. One of it was I wanted to be in a smaller environment. I didn't want to be in sort of an industrial space with thousands of other students. As I said, I was quite specific about the case study method. I also did not want to be in a big city. I just felt like, I'm going to be dealing with enough being in graduate school. I don't want to have to deal with transportation across a big city, high rents, right? All of that. So I think, my advice would be think about things like that. It makes a difference. Think about the kind of people you want to be around. Think about, things like the network, the environment, the culture. I think that's all really important, not just about rankings or, salaries that people get when they come out, because that's also dependent on so many different things. And then think about how that will play out for the rest of your career as well. It's easy to say, oh, business school, 2 years, right? But it does. I think it really does. It sets you up for the rest of your career. So yeah, those are some things I would be reflecting on if I were making the choice.
Well, Lucy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was so great talking with you about your story and your Darden journey specifically, and what you've been up to since graduation. So appreciate your perspectives and your willingness to share your time with our listeners today. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. This has been fun. Thank you.
And that was a conversation with Lucy Alexander, a member of the full-time MBA class of 2001 here at the Darden School of Business. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. You can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.